And so I'm going to start out with just a very quick review. And so remember, we talked about the goal, and the goal is not to win an argument. The goal is not to convince the person that evolution is wrong, that atheism is wrong. The ultimate goal is to encourage them to obey the gospel. In other words, to accept the free gift of salvation. Again, by hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, being baptized, and remaining faithful. And of course, we talked about also just briefly referred to some of the examples in the book of Acts about that. So that's the goal, that's the first point. Now, it is our choice, and so we get to choose whether we'll be spending eternity with God, or whether we'll be spending eternity separated from God. And so when we think about that, that is the most important decision we ever make. God lets us make all kinds of choices. I got to choose which desserts to have. I chose to have several desserts, and so that was a good choice. But they were all very. But so we get to make all kinds of choices. But obviously, the most important choice is whether or not to accept the free gift of salvation. And so along those lines, that's why we say always stay focused on eternity. Now that gets easier as we get older, because a lot of times for round numbers, I mean, unfortunately any one of us could pass away this afternoon. But if we're just thinking in general, most of us agree that, wow, if I live to be 100 years old, that's a really long physical life. We could also, we could look in the Bible and say, well, Methuselah lived to be 969 years old. That was a really, really long life. But in reality, 100 years and 969 years, those are zero compared to eternity. And so when we're making our choices, making our decisions, we really need to stay focused on eternity. Now, we'll have to make choices on earth. I mean, that's everything from what job to take, to who to marry, to where to live. We make those choices on earth, but again, the most important one are the ones that really affect our eternity. Now we talked about how, just some questions we might get asked. One of the ones, of course, is, well, if God made the universe, who made God? And so we referred back to Genesis 1:1, where it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And so since in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that means not only did he create the heavens and the earth, he also created time. Since God created time, he must be outside of time. And so since God is outside of the dimension of time, he cannot have a beginning or an end. And so the Bible addresses that in the very first verse. By definition, God could not have been made because he actually made time. And that was a little hard to think about, but again, outside the dimension of time, the words beginning and end, they don't make any sense. And then we talked a little more detail about just life. Again, even the simplest bacteria is vastly more complicated than anything we've ever made. And so to say it's scientific to believe that life could just make itself, it's actually much less scientific than saying an airplane can make itself. Because we can make airplanes, we can't make life. And this is where there's some really good resources on the table. There is one, it's called the Stairway to Life on the table. And that gives a lot more detail. And so we're talking about, okay, how do we make this possibly useful, things that we can apply? Usually if you just point out that, hey, we can make airplanes, we can't make life, that's enough to get the person thinking. But sometimes they might say, oh, well, they might just act like they want more detail. There is so much technical detail available now that we can pursue that. And because again, going back to the goal is to get them really to objectively consider the Bible, objectively consider whether they're putting their faith. And then genetic information, it's not created by mutations and natural selection. And so literally all of the examples of evolution given in any textbook or online or museums, they don't show genetic information being created. And very often they show genetic information being lost. And so it's easy to think about example we gave was if we develop a, say, a breed of dogs like a poodle, the way that breed of dog is developed is by removing genetic information. A poodle might be this big, so you have to get rid of the genetic information for a large dog. You have to get rid of genetic information for long fur. You have to, a lot of information has to be removed. And so that's the opposite of evolution. And to me that's what's really ironic, is sometimes people will say, well, here's a perfect example of evolution. And when you look at what they're saying, it's actually the opposite of evolution. Because it's an example of genetic information being removed instead of being added. Then we talked about how the Big Bang is not a scientific theory. And the reason is a scientific theory has to be falsifiable. In other words, it has to be some kind of experiment or observation that could prove that theory wrong. And the way that the Big Bang is constructed, the way that whole theory is phrased, it doesn't matter what we observe, we can always add what they call like an adjustable parameter, or we can change an assumption to pretend the theory is still true. But it's funny, it's not just small changes we've had to make. Literally, right now for the Big Bang to work, we have to make up 96% of the universe. In other words, we have to say that only 4% of the universe is what we actually observe, and the other 96% is made up. And the specifics, just a little more detail, 73% of that is what they call dark energy, 23% is that they call dark matter, you have inflation, you have other adjustable parameters, they call them. But when you think about that, if we're allowed to make up 96% of the universe, then it totally doesn't matter what our observations are. We just change how we're making things up. And we can pretend that any set of observations supports any theory we want. And then with radiometric dating, a lot of times, if we assume the Bible is false, in other words, we assume the Bible's wrong, and so in other words, we don't take into account effects of the global flood, we don't take into account effects of recent creation, then we make those assumptions. We assume that the creation wasn't recent. 6,000 years is a long time ago, but 6,000 years ago, and we assume there was not a flood. Then we can plug those assumptions into other factors, I guess you would say, and say, oh, well, we've just shown the Bible's false. But you see that it's circular reasoning at best, because what we're saying is if we assume the Bible's false, we can then use those assumptions to show the Bible's false. But that's not science. I mean, it's just, again, it's just circular reasoning. And so that's what you see a lot with carbon dating. With carbon dating, they assume there wasn't a global flood, they assume there wasn't a recent creation, and then they say, oh, we use carbon dating to show the Bible is false. And then for other radiometric dating methods, that was, the radiometric dating was always an outlier. Most of the methods would indicate the Earth is, again, relatively young, less than 10,000 years old. But if certain assumptions were made with radiometric dating, people could claim the Earth was, say, 4.54 billion years old. But those assumptions that they were making were shown false in about the year 2006, because one of the key assumptions was that the radioactive decay rates never change. And in 2006, it became widely reported that even today we're seeing fluctuations in those decay rates. Okay, so that was a quick review. Now, if you want to close your eyes, I'm going to go through about 15 slides just so you don't get dizzy, and then we'll start more than 15. Okay, here we go. So, no, not quite. So I thought we'd talk about...
Louder volume?
Pardon? Oh, louder volume? Volume good?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right, so then what I thought we'd talk about that's new is the flood and the fossil record. Okay. And so the reason this is important is, the flood's referred to a lot in the Bible. and it's also another way, especially the fossil record, where people can be led astray in this area. They say somehow, well, this fossil shows that this animal was turning into this animal. And the point we want to make there is that within the fossil record, all we're finding is bones, and those bones are very subject to interpretation. And so we'll talk about that more, but did want to just start out with some of the biblical references to the flood. Go with 2 Peter 3:3-6. It says, knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? But since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. For this they willfully forget that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water in the water, by which the world that then existed perished, being flooded with water. Okay, so again, this reference to the flood. And then goes on, 1 Peter 3:20-22, who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. There is also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him. So when we talk about baptism, of course, we a lot of times, like did at the end of the sermon, you can say, well, you can go back to the book of Acts and you look at examples. The people are always baptized, but even throughout Scripture, baptism is referred to. In this case, it's talking about Noah's flood, but it also ties that into why we were baptized today. So again, the flood itself is referred to for very important topics. In this case, it's how we are saved, how we accept that gift of salvation. It was also important to keep in mind the flood was really devastating beyond comparison or comprehension. There is a really good DVD back there, is Genesis History, and it shows just the effects of what would be a really small flood. In this case, it was one caused by a volcano that erupted in the United States, Mount St. Helens. But you can just look at the effects from a relatively small flood, and even they were just extreme, carving canyons in matters of minutes. I mean, deep canyons, laying down sediment, hours, but we were talking like tens of meters of sediment, canyons tens of meters deep, just carved very quickly. All these things that we had been told, oh, those take millions of years, but we were seeing them happen just very quickly. And so even a small flood shows these evidences, but we have to realize that the flood described in the Bible is just incredible, beyond comprehension. In Genesis 6:13, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Genesis 6:17, behold, I myself am bringing flood waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on earth shall die. Genesis 7:4, for after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. And of course, God always does what he says. And so Genesis 7:19-23, it says, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life, all that was on dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and birds of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. So again, devastating beyond comprehension. And then should also mention, okay, so you have this devastating flood. Well, what are some of the things you would expect? Well, one of them is you had the flood, Noah and his sons and their wives, they left the ark. And then, of course, they decided to not fill the earth as they were instructed. And so at the Tower of Babel, when they were constructing a tower, that was when God confused the language and they were scattered. And so, but what's interesting is, so they were scattered. As far as we know, those cultures did not communicate with each other after they were scattered at the Tower of Babel. Every culture, every major culture on earth has a flood. They call it flood legend. They talk about a flood. And so you think about, well, why would that be? Well, it makes total sense if you think, well, they were scattered at the Tower of Babel. they all knew about the flood, and then over time, yeah, you might have different things added to the story. A lot of times, like kings in those times, they would try to kind of steer they knew there was a flood, but they tried to steer it towards I won't say necessarily making themselves look good, but making their society look good, things like that. But it's really interesting. All major cultures talk about the flood. So the obvious explanation is, well, why did they all talk about a flood? Well, there was a flood. That's it's really hard to. People say, well, maybe they all just made up this idea about a flood. Well, boy, there's a lot of consistency amongst those legends also. So that's kind of interesting. I think there might be a book on the table that talks more about a lot of they'll call them flood legends. But again, it's just an interesting study also. Okay, so again, you look at the information that we have today, and I have to go fairly quickly because I know it's a lot we want to cover. But you have this was some effects of Mount St. Helens in the upper right here. And you see these were strata that were laid down. And if you look at the strata, there's obviously no erosion between the layers because there wasn't time for erosion between the layers. So there wasn't time for, they were just laid down very quickly. They look very similar to the strata that you see in the Grand Canyon, which is shown here, a picture of the Grand Canyon. Oops, sorry. You also show there's evidence that there was an ice age. Well, that would be triggered by a global flood if you assume the fountains of the Great Deep warmed the oceans up, which we have evidence for. That's your source of moisture, but also if they were triggered by volcanism, which we have this evidence for, then that would cause ash in the upper atmosphere that would cause the air to be cold and lots of moisture. Well, that's how you get really big snowfall. And it's literally the only way to trigger an ice age. There's theories like the Milankovitch theory. There's like 60 theories about how could you trigger an ice age. We plug those into our climate models. They don't work. The global flood is the best explanation for an ice age, and we see lots of evidence that there was actually an ice age. And then fossil graveyards. If you see you have a flood, you'll notice that a lot of times the area that flooded is completely clear until you get to a certain area, and then all the debris is piled up in one area. Okay, so that's an effect we see of a flood. So a lot of times, if a river floods, you'll see it's clear, but then trash and trees and stuff, they're all piled up in one area. Well, that's again what we see in the fossil record. You can go hundreds of kilometers and not see a single fossil. And then all of a sudden there's what they call a fossil graveyard where the fossils just all piled together. My son and I, we got to go to a place in Wyoming that was a fossil graveyard. And we basically said, well, where should we dig? And it was basically, well, anywhere. And as soon as you start digging, you get about 3 feet down and you find dinosaur bones. And so we have in some sub-basement of some university somewhere, there's a hadrosaur bone named after my son and I. So, they're just real easy to find because of those fossil graveyards. Talk about the no weathering and erosion between layers. What I mean by that is, again, if there's a flat layer laid down, if it just stops, well, you're going to have animals digging in it, you're going to have plants growing out of it, you're going to have rainfall hitting it, carving channels in it. You see all this erosion. When we look at places like the Grand Canyon, you don't see erosion between the layers. So they had to be laid down very quickly because there wasn't time for layers. Very consistent with the global flood. Very inconsistent with many of the traditional explanations. You have rock layers that go clear across continents, evidence of sand being transported great distances, marine fossils on tops of mountains, again, all very consistent with the global flood. Okay, so now I'm going to skip a few more slides. Lots of good stuff that we'll talk about sometime. Talk about the Ice Age, but then I think where we'll go now. Let's see. Okay, unfortunately, I might have the wrong slide deck up. Let me see. No, not really. Lots of good stuff here, but I got the wrong deck, I think. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, all right. Okay, so any questions on those last 100 slides that we just clicked through? Okay, so so now what I really want to talk about now is the fossil record, because this is a point that people bring up a lot. So the first one is, has anybody heard of transitional forms? You ever heard that term? So they have what they call transitional forms, and this is supposedly evidence in the fossil record of one kind of animal turning into another, but we don't see that. In other words, you don't see transitional forms in the fossil record. So an example of a transitional form would be, say we didn't have dogs alive today, but we just had bones of dogs. And so you have a very small dog, that's a Yorkie on the left, and then like a medium-sized dog would be a Beagle, and a large dog would be a German Shepherd. Well, today we know they're all dogs, and that's what we call variation within a kind. And we know in the original DNA that God created, dogs had the DNA, the information in their DNA for all those breeds of dogs that we see today. But if we didn't know that, you could also find just bones and say, well, maybe Yorkies evolved into Beagles that evolved into German Shepherds. And so that would be the idea of the transitional forms. So, but literally everything we see when we find fossils, sometimes people say, well, maybe this is a transitional form. It turns out it's either variation within a kind, in other words, the same kind of animal, or it's a completely different kind of animal, but we don't see transitional forms. And so that's an important point as we go forward. I want to see if I had, I don't think I have it. Okay, so.
But I don't think there's any other species of animals that have so many variations.
Yeah, so they think cats.
Usually you see standard types of animals, from giraffes from the northernmost part of Africa to the southernmost, zebras. There's slight differences. This is purely, the dog example is purely human driven.
Right, breeding, yeah.
Yeah.
Now they, what they have done is they'll do reverse breeding studies. But you're absolutely right. So like with cats, what they'll assume is, for example, like you can breed a lion and a tiger, and it gives you a liger, or I guess it's a tiger and a lion is a tigon. And so by the reverse breeding, they'll say that those tigers and lions could have come from a single cat kind. And so I think they're down, this is, secular and Christian like. So when they talk about a kind in the Bible, it's usually at the family level. And so, but that's exactly what you're saying. They're trying to always, I think that's usually the criteria they use, is if you can take something that we would consider different species today, breed them back together. I guess it gets up to like a genus level, and then within the genuses, you can usually go up to the family level. But then very few kinds would have been at the order level. So when the Bible talks about the kinds of animals, God created certain kinds. Most people say it's at the family level, but I think, I can't remember, one of them, a few of them are at the order level, where you could literally start but you could start at a family level and have it. So like, black bears, brown bears, polar bears, grizzly bears, they're all the same kind, or which would be about at the family level. But you're right. I would say dogs probably are the most. There's all kinds of different cat varieties bred today, but I think dogs, that's probably is a good way to phrase it. That's probably the most we've ever really explored what kind of the total extent of the genetic information that's available. If that makes sense, because we've developed so many different breeds of dogs, essentially from a single pair of dogs. So that's a really good point. You can just look at, every breed of dog, you just look at how different they look, and then that's all, basically from a pair of dogs. And some people say it's a few hundred years ago, before, when most of the breeds started to get developed. So that's a good point. Then the couple of quotes also, when people are looking at the fossil record. This is David Pilbeam. He was at Yale University, and he's talking about, in this case, just the idea of, this whole idea of transitional forms of maybe one kind of animal turning into another. And I should go back, we'll talk about this more. The reason we know that doesn't happen is also because of the genetic information that'd be required. But his quote was, so again, he's paleoanthropologist, Yale's fairly famous. He says, I'm also aware of the fact that at least in my own subject of paleoanthropology, theory heavily influenced by implicit ideas almost always dominates data. Ideas that are totally unrelated to actual fossils have dominated theory building, which in turn strongly influence the way fossils are interpreted. So really what he's saying is if you have a theory that says, hey, this animal turned into that animal, and someone finds a bone, there's going to be this temptation to make that bone fit into that theory. Even though from the bone, you really, at absence of the theory, you wouldn't know. You'd just you'd view it from a different way. And it goes back to what we talked about, worldview and things like that. This is one on transitional forms. Now this one's interesting because this was about 30 years ago, 40 years ago almost. This situation unfortunately has changed because now most of the textbooks, they'll actually just kind of make up transitional forms to say, like, again, it's kind of like we were talking about, they'll say, well, we know this turned into this, but then you have to read in the fine print for them to say, well, all we really found was this, and this is all just an artist's conception. And so this particular scientist was saying that's not right. He was, again, he's very, high position. He's a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History. He was writing a book and he didn't show any transitional forms in his book. And so they said, well, you need to put some transitional forms in there. And so this was his quote. He said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where to get the information from, I cannot honestly provide it. And if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? So I'm going to start out now with a few examples, but before I get into this, should have also mentioned early on, there are the two explanations for the fossil record. When we talk about transitional forms, we talk about fossils. One is that, at the bottom of the fossil record, well, those are, maybe animals that evolved first. And then as you move up through the fossil record, some of those are animals that evolved later and later and later. And that's where some people try to say, well, there should be transitional forms. That's what we don't see. And so that's kind of, I say, the evolutionary model. The biblical model, one of the, I guess I'll say the most accepted ones, is that the fossil record is just the order that things were buried during the flood. And so when you see things like the Cambrian explosion, where all of these fossils show up all at once, well, it's actually a whole ecosystem. It's not just one form of life, it's a whole ecosystem is at the same level in the fossil record. So the explanation is, okay, that habitat was destroyed early on in the flood, and that's where you would tie it back to, say, the fountains of the Great Deep. In other words, that habitat, when the fountains of the Great Deep erupted, that was the habitat that was buried first. And then as you go up through the fossil record, you really are seeing ecosystems being buried, not individual animals. When you do see individual animals, they start out here, they end up, they're the same. So like sharks, sometimes people will say, well, sharks are the same throughout the entire fossil record. Well, that makes total sense from a biblical worldview. They show up, they're sharks, and the last ones seen in the fossil record are sharks. And so it's really hard to, you don't have any transitions leading to the shark. They show up, they're sharks, and then they don't change, and they're still sharks. And so that's a, it's one, you could say, well, they evolved really fast. That's called punctuated equilibrium. That's why they just show up as shark. And then they were so perfect that they didn't change, and that's why they stayed sharks. And you could say that, and that would be maybe an evolutionary spin on it. But again, it's also, I'd say more consistent, that's opinion, but more consistent with the Bible, because that's exactly what you'd expect to see from the order of burial, really just being the order that the habitats were destroyed during the flood, the order that the animal was buried during the flood. Any questions on what we just talked about so far? So we're going to go into some examples now. Yeah.
So I have two questions actually.
Okay.
One's for the dinosaurs. Like in the Bible say they talk about the Leviathan and
Yes.
It's
in the book of Job, it talks
Yes.
about Leviathan. And
So it's can we tell that's one of the facts that say dinosaurs
Yeah, that
It's
would
in
be
the
a,
Bible.
the creature described would match certain dinosaurs, doesn't match anything that's alive today. So yeah, so on this subject, so like I think, we know life can't make itself. And that's true science. You can apply it. We've tried it. We know from studying the genome, you're not adding genetic information. You start looking at the fossil record. A lot of times, they say this is very consistent with the Bible. So Behemoth and Leviathan, very consistent with the Bible. You have drawings in caves of creatures that look a lot like an apatosaurus. That's consistent with the Bible. You have dragon legends in a lot of cultures. The way that dragons are described, very consistent with what we know about dinosaurs. So, it's a lot of evidence, but you can't, have to be careful that it doesn't prove it. It's just very consistent with it. And that's just me. I mean, depending on who you're talking to, if they don't, you could say it proves beyond a reasonable doubt. Yeah, we could probably say that. But
yes, you have we talk about people who doesn't believe it, what the Bible say.
Right.
But you have Christians who doesn't believe it, what science says and what the Bible says about it.
Right.
You have skeptical Christians too. So.
Yeah. It's I think the soft tissue in dinosaur bones is actually a pretty big one, because it wasn't just we know the soft tissue can't last millions of years. It's amazing it even lasts thousands of years, and then they find it in dinosaur bones. And so and it's also interesting to see the response as soon as people start reporting, they're finding soft tissue in dinosaur bones. The immediate response was, that's impossible, it can't be, there's no way, from the atheistic community. And it took a long time for people now to accept, well, you find soft tissue in dinosaur bones, and they've really at this point just trying to ignore it. They say, well, there must be some way that it could have survived for millions of years. Well, there's no way it could have survived for millions of years. There's no credible way that you get in nature that's going to survive millions of years. And so they just kind of try to ignore that. It's kind of like they tried to ignore the mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome information for a long time. Now everybody says, well, no, we did all come from a single woman. We did all come from, because it was single man. And they even co-opted Christian terms. You have a mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. So it's it's all very consistent with the Bible, and so, but that's for this section. That's probably as far as the free will proves we have a soul. That one's airtight. The atheists agree that you have to have a soul to have free will. The life from non-life. So those are the ones I'd say that really first start getting someone thinking. But if they start saying, well, what about the fossil record? This is, to me, it's more just pointing out that the fossil record is more consistent with the biblical account than the atheistic account.
On mitochondrial DNA, that one's always confused me, because you can trace someone's lineage through women, because it's on X chromosome,
right,
back certain generations, because it immediately gets passed on as the energy producer in the cell.
right.
But the thing that I don't understand is that, in a sense, it's different in different lineages.
Right.
Because you are able to track people who are related to each other based on this mitochondrial DNA. But that kind of goes against it leading to one female ancestor, because we all have different mitochondrial DNA.
Right. So it's the rate they're mutating, and so they look at the rate they're mutating, the differences, and then that's how they trace back to say there's one female ancestor. But it's the difference is, from the Bible, we'd say, okay, that was 6,000 years ago. And I think now they're saying like 118,000 years ago is the evolution. So they agree that it's and so their assumption is the mutation rate is that we all descended from a common ape-like creature. And so they look at the differences between apes and humans, and that's how they come up with the 118-ish. For the 6,000, it's exactly what you're saying, because all you can really measure today is the daughter, the mother, the grandmother, the great-grandmother, maybe the great-great-grandmother. So you get the measured mutation rate, and then that's the one that's consistent with 6,000 years ago. So depending on the assumption, if you assume we had to all come from a common ape-like creature, you'll get the one age. If you're using that method, and then if you assume that you're just measuring what you can measure today, then you get the other age.
Darwin says, but like sometimes it have kind of sense. It makes kind of sense at some point. Like he has something in the, I think it's Galapagos Island. I don't know. He was talking about like the two species of birds. Like the one who eats the red
Oh yeah,
ones
the Darwin's
and then-
finches. Yeah.
I mean, it can have sense, right? But
Yes, so it's the difference in the population
Yes.
density that changes, and so let me, let's go back and jump to that one, and we'll come back to.
because I mean, I don't believe it come from apes, but from the monkeys, but like, but like that can have some sense, right? Like you have to.
Yes, so that's the key is it's the information for both of those beak shapes was always there. Okay, so this will be an analogy. Now, unfortunately, this was because there's two ways that that's often explained in the textbooks, and this is the one that was in most of the U.S. textbooks. It's peppered moths, but it's exactly analogous to the Darwin's finches. And so, because with the Darwin's finches on certain islands, the food source, it's easier to eat if you have like a long, thin beak. And on other islands, the food source, I think the softer, smaller berries are easier with the long, narrow beak. And then the hard nuts that you have to crack, that's consistent with the bigger, stronger beak. But the information for both beak shapes is always there. So you're not seeing new creation or new information created. This is analogous. In this case, it was the peppered moths, and they studied these. They were around England, and the form on the left side, that was what they called the typica form. And before 1850, the tree bark was a lot like this. And we've actually seen some trees like that when we were here today, or last few days. It's you have some light colored tree bark, with black spots on the tree bark, and so you can see how that moth on the left would blend in. But there's also variation of this moth that's very dark colored, and that moth would be easy to see on that tree. I mean, you just almost visualize it. So the bird's going to be tending to eat the carbonaria form, the dark color on there, and not eating the typica form. And so before the Industrial Revolution, this is how it's presented in our textbooks. Well, 98% of the moths were the typica form, only 2% were the carbonaria form. Industrial Revolution, apparently the air got so polluted that the tree bark turned dark. Okay, and so now, again, you can visualize it, that carbonaria form is camouflaged. Birds not going to be able to see it. The typica form now, it has that light color on it, so the bird can see that. So the population density apparently flipped. And so before the Industrial Revolution, it was 98% typica, 2% carbonaria. During the Industrial Revolution, it was flipped. It was 98% carbonaria, 2% typica. They clean up the air, I think it was about 1950. The trees go back to the normal color, it flips back. Okay, so now they're back to 90% typica, 2% carbonaria. And so our textbooks at least said, here, this is evolution in action, this is proof of evolution. But I think you already see that has nothing to do with evolution, because it's just the population density flipping back and forth. All the genetic information was always there, so there was no new genetic information created. Darwin's finches are the same way, but you're right. A lot of the textbooks now are talking about Darwin's finches. So it's and that's what's that's the leading example that they're using for evolution. It doesn't have anything to do with evolution. And then we mentioned on bacteria. A lot of times, when bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics, it's actually they lose information. We disguise the antibiotic as a nutrient, and if it loses the information to absorb that nutrient, it all of a sudden it's antibiotic resistant. But it developed the antibiotic resistance, but it was by losing information that's the opposite. So just try to think of the
It's environment actually. It doesn't have to like be DNA or something. It's like the environment.
Yeah, it's just a selection pressure.
Okay, got it.
Because that same bacteria, that is now antibiotic resistant, if you take the antibiotic away, it's actually weaker because it can't absorb the nutrient. We're disguising the poison as a nutrient. Okay, so that's how the antibiotic works. If you get rid of that antibiotic, then it can't absorb that nutrient either. So it's actually lost information. It's actually weaker, but the selection pressure changed. Just like the selection pressure here changed when we covered the tree bark with soot, and so, but it's, so always try to go back and look at the information in the genome, the information in the DNA, and that's where you don't see examples of evolution, a lot of, so to me it's still the free will, proving we have a soul, which proves God, and then the life making itself. Those are the easiest ones to explain, but this is the one that people probably get led astray the most often, because you'll have tech teachers editions in the US, they'll say, well, send your student down to the pet store and ask them if they see a new breed of dog, and say, well, that's a change, and this is really deceptive. They'll say, well, evolution is just change, and when they see that new breed of dog, that's change, so that proves evolution. But the change from a new breed of dog is the opposite of evolution, because the way you develop that new breed of dog is removing genetic information. You don't add genetic information. So it's very deceptive, but with that terminology, yeah, I mean, any of us can go down to the pet store, like you said. I mean, there's a new breed every month practically, because of the popular. Anyway, great question. Anything else? Okay, great discussion though. This is what keeps it interesting. So what I'll do is I'll just go through a few examples very quickly, because I know I don't want to keep you guys too much longer. I appreciate your attention so far. This was just an example. Okay, this one was a fraud, but it was a very well advertised fraud. It's National Geographic. I don't know, it's a fairly famous magazine in the U.S. It's called National Geographic, and they offered a large sum of money for anyone that could provide evidence that dinosaurs turned into birds. And so when you think about it, and again, you can give other examples, that's a really poor way to do science. What you want to do is just offer money for just evidence, if you have to offer money at all. But it does, for people to go out and look for evidence, they need some incentive. So unfortunately what happened here is people were taking the head and body of a bird and gluing the tail of a dinosaur on the end, or maybe a little more sophisticated than gluing, not much more sophisticated. Anyway, they sold the fossil, got displayed in the National Geographic Explorers Hall for a few months. About 110,000 people saw it, mostly children. And but really from the start, there was also a lot of scientists saying this is obviously a fraud. And so it was, but it got a lot of traction. I mean, again, it's in their museum for several months. So this is a quote, this is Storrs Olson, curator of birds at the National Museum of Natural History. And he basically, well, I'll read the quote real quick. It says, the idea of feathered dinosaurs and the theropod origin of birds is being actively promulgated by a cadre of zealous scientists acting in concert with certain editors at Nature and National Geographic, who themselves have become outspoken and highly biased proselytizers of the faith. Truth and careful scientific weighing of the evidence have been among the first casualties in the program, which is now fast becoming one of the grander scientific hoaxes of our age, the paleontological equivalent of cold fusion. So again, a lot of big words there, but it's basically, this guy, he's the curator of birds at the National Museum of Natural History, so he could be viewed as the world's expert, and he's already calling them out, saying this is obviously a hoax. It also made some of the U.S. newspapers as a retraction. But we talked about, okay, you're trying to evangelize people. I always wonder if you went to all those 110,000 people that were told, hey, here's a fossil that proves dinosaurs turned into birds. How are you going to convince them they didn't really see that? Because they'll be like, no, I was third grade, I was on a field trip, I saw it with my own eyes, you don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, so you almost have to go back and say, no, here's where they retracted the article, here's where they retracted. So again, it's, and there's a lot of cases that happens. But again, you can apply true science. If a dinosaur were to turn into a bird, you'd have to have a completely different bone structure, completely different respiratory structure. You'd have to turn scales into feathers. We know from true science, and just you start looking even the difference between a scale and a feather. See on the side here, the scale is just a fold of skin. Feathers, it's actually really detailed structure to allow a bird to fly. And that's what we can't even duplicate that, even trying to reverse engineer using our best modern manufacturing techniques. Can't duplicate that kind of structure yet. So again, there's many reasons to know dinosaurs didn't turn into birds. And so someone says, well, we found this fossil. And right now they even talk about, like, there's just fossils where you see like little indentations maybe in the bone. And they draw these holes. It must have been, this and this and this and this. And it's a huge extrapolation. Now, one of the bigger ones of our bigger points is, again, this whole idea that the fossils are very subject to interpretation. Now, this was a long time ago. This was about 100 years ago. This wasn't a fraud, but it just shows how subject to interpretation fossils are. So what had happened was they found a tooth okay? And that tooth was sent to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and it was declared to be human. Okay, so someone finds a tooth, and it's sent to the museum, and it's declared to be human. Well, it didn't look, it looked enough different that they said, okay, what kind of human would that belong to? Okay, so all they have is a tooth. So this is what they called Nebraska Man. Okay, so you see Nebraska Man, that's from a tooth. So right there you have a lot of interpretation. I mean, he's got abs, and he's good shape. Then from you also, though, they said, okay, again, just an artist illustration, but you're saying, okay, we know what kind of weapon Nebraska Man used. Okay, from a tooth, we know what kind of livestock he had. Okay, see the camels in the background there? Okay, and then from a tooth, we even know what his wife looked like. Okay, so this is a tooth. Okay, and so the problem is this was illustrated London News. The public imagination gets going. Oh, there's cavemen. You can imagine just the it's just the imagination, the fun of thinking about, wow, there are these cavemen running around doing this and this and this, and they have clothes on. Well, it turns out it wasn't even a human tooth. It was the tooth was from an extinct pig. Okay, so but you have all this, and so that was one of the ones that was credited for generating this whole fascination with cavemen. But it also there was a trial that we had. It's kind of one of those trials where you're trying to set a precedent in the U.S. about, well, should we teach that apes turned into humans? And this was evidence available at that trial because that trial was in 1925, and in 1925 we still believed all this. It hadn't been shown that it was false again. So if you go forward, now this is interesting because this is a situation where things have been improving a lot in the last few years. This was probably about 20 years ago. And there was this whole series of like museums and zoos in the U.S. where they would essentially take a go down to like a clothing store, like a child's clothing store, and one of the mannequins, sometimes they'll have a mannequin and they'll put clothes on that mannequin. What they're doing is they're basically taking those mannequins, putting hair on the feet, taking the child's head off, putting a monkey head on top, and saying that this was Lucy. Now Lucy, Australopithecines, those are real fossils that we have found, and so we knew that was wrong. I mean, we had the bones. It was advertised as a fossil we had found, when in reality it was, it's nothing at all like what we'd actually seen. And so this is a quote. I just have about 3 pages of quotes here on this. I'll just read it. It says, "The usual artistic license in reconstructing the fleshly features of ape from bones allows evolutionary bias enormous free rein. However, artists do not usually misrepresent the bones. This statue's feet and hands are simply wrong and mislead the public." And this is Dr. David Minton. He's Associate Professor of Anatomy at Neurobiology at Washington University. Cites evolutionary sources which show that creatures in this species had hands and feet which were not at all like human hands and feet. Rather, they have long, curved fingers and toes, even more so than apes today that live mostly in the trees. Goes on and says, Canadian school teacher David Buckner has weighed in on the debate by posting an internet challenge to this misleading statue. He says that if people visiting this exhibition were to see an accurate replica of Lucy in the trees with features typical of tree-dwelling primates, it would make them question the whole notion of human evolution. Lucy would be seen as just some sort of extinct ape. Bruce Carr, the zoo's director of education, has no plans to alter the exhibit. We cannot be updating every exhibit based on every new piece of evidence, he says. What we look at is the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think that the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct. That last sentence is kind of disturbing, because it's like he knows it's, because usually you expect the person to at least say, well, I'd love to update it, we don't have the time, we don't have the money. You just say, no, I'm not going to change it, because it's the impression he wants to create is that Lucy is this ape-like creature evolving into a human. And even though he knows it's wrong, he's not going to change it. So that's, again, that's not science. Dr. Minton points out that if Lucy's feet were accurately shown, it would be obvious they could never fit in the famous Laetoli fossil footprints. These are Exhibit A for evolutionary belief in upright walking of Lucy's kind, where in fact they are identical to barefoot humans. And so those are just footprints, and they really are just barefoot humans, especially humans that have, typically don't wear shoes. And so it goes on, Professor Betsy Schumann, evolutionary expert at Menton's University, admits that the statue's feet are probably not accurate, but when asked whether the statue should be changed, she says absolutely not. So again, why would you say absolutely not? I mean, it's, and so this is what Lucy would actually look like based on the actual fossil finds. And so you can see why, if they're showing this, showing that foot, showing that head, you're not going to want to change it to that. But that's what, just based on a typical fossil reconstruction, Lucy would look like. So that was, 20, maybe even 25 years ago. So it's gotten a little better. They recently overhauled the whole exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And there's, excuse me. So they're starting to acknowledge this. So this is kind of the Lucy exhibit. And it says, the brown bones are casts of parts of Lucy's skeleton that were excavated. The black bones represent missing parts. They were filled in using mirror images of bones that were found. Fossils from other individual Lucy species. Okay, so that all kind of makes sense. You know, you only find so many bones, and so you have to make certain assumptions. You know, and so they're assuming mirror image. You know, we see a lot of symmetry in life. Okay, you're assuming that. Other things, but this last one again, it's a little bit. You can see the bias, I guess you'd say, the worldview, because they're saying they've got these ape bones and they're reconstructing them based on their knowledge of human anatomy. But one of the things they had to do was change the pelvis, because the pelvis, as found, was very clearly the pelvis of an ape, something that wasn't walking upright. And so they actually postulated, and there's a good DVD back there, it's Lucy, She's No Lady. It shows the actual BBC clip where you're like 40 minutes into this special, and it's an evolutionist special, and it says, well, we knew the pelvis couldn't be right, so they assumed that a deer had stepped on the pelvis, and then somehow the bones had gotten in a place where they refused together, and that's why it sure looks like an ape pelvis, even though we know it had to be a human pelvis. So they still have the human-looking pelvis on it. And again, it's just unless someone happened to be watching that particular special, where they said, how did they change it? You know, but the way they said it was, well, obviously since we knew it, that justified somehow changing the actual evidence. So the pelvis is still wrong, but you notice they are at least showing the hands and fingers and toes are a little more curved. But this whole knowledge of human anatomy, again, it actually does affect how the fossils interpret. Because if you think this has to look like a human, then you're going to have to do things like, well, maybe the actual pelvis was broken and then reconfigured in a way, and you know, it's anyway. So that's still a bias. Lucy's species had compact feet that supported the body's weight during upright walking, but look at the toe bones; they are longer, more curved than those of modern human foot, more like those of tree-climbing apes. Okay, that is amazing to me that they've got that statement in there. So again, it's good news. I mean, there are people, this is the actual science, this is actual data, comparing that to 20 years ago when people were saying, no, don't change the statue, leave the human feet on it. Now, this is probably the most famous museum in the US, and it's readily admitting, longer, more curved than those of modern human foot, more like those of tree-climbing apes. So that's great. Unfortunately, then it goes downhill. Okay? So now you go to the next one. So this is Lucy. Well, wait, that's not looking like the actual fossil really anymore. The toes, they're still showing a little longer, but they're not curved. Yeah, they're looking more human. But then facial expression. So to me, that looks like a human facial expression, and they could never figure out why. It just looks human. I'm told everybody yesterday I'm horrible at art, so I don't know how you make something look human. Well, someone pointed out to me that the reason is, you see the whites of the eyes, you see the way the creature's looking, you really see the whites of the eyes. Apparently in apes, you don't see the whites of their eyes. And so I started looking at pictures of chimps and gorillas and anything else, and sure enough, you don't see the whites of their eyes. So by putting the whites of the eyes in that reconstruction, very subconsciously, because again, I was like, why does that look human? You know, but that's, I think why is because you're actually seeing the whites of the eyes of the ape. And then it just goes completely incorrect. Okay, so this is the next panel. Okay, so now okay, we're now establishing that chimps and humans, they think the same way, they even put their hand on their chin the same way, they scratch whatever you're scratching the same way, you know. Okay, and then again, it's just trying to create this impression that, okay, apes turned into humans, apes are the same as humans. If you can see this picture in the middle, I was just taking these on my phone, and this was, this one is just, it's literally, this looks like just like a person. It's almost like they're looking across at another creature like this, just asking them, hey, you going to the soccer game tonight, you know, or hey, you want to go get dinner tonight, you know. So it's just over the top. I mean, and so, but this is the most famous museum in the U.S. It's a multi-$100-million exhibit, but you see, they're still trying to make that impression. So, so I'm just hopeful. Again, especially this admission was huge, and so hopefully, if they overhaul it again in 20 years, they'll at least get rid of some of the additional things that they mentioned. So that's, but that's probably the biggest one. Now there's two books and a DVD right there. What happened is in 2018, we actually mapped the chimp genome. So when we were mapping the human genome, my wife actually worked on the human genome project out at Los Alamos. It was $1 billion to map the human genome. And so you're not going to spend $1 billion. It's hard to come up with $1 billion, but the human genome is so important. So we mapped that. That was around the year 2000. Now it's gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So now you can do pretty good mapping of a genome for a few $1,000s. And so that's the technology. So in 2018, they were able to get the money to map the chimp genome. Okay, and so what they found, and unfortunately I don't have it in this one, the chimp genome. They now know that there was this thing called chromosome 2 fusion. From mapping the chimp genome, they now know that that didn't occur because they can look at the basically the telomeres that they see, the functionality of what they used to think was a fusion site. They'd have centromeres, they call them like fossil centromeres, all those things that they were postulating. They found by actually mapping the chimp genome aren't there. And so they also found that the differences in the chimp Y chromosome, this goes to the other, are much greater from the human Y chromosome than the other DNA sequences. So in other words, if they were to, but the Y chromosome DNA changes more slowly. So it basically you think, okay, you're starting with this common ancestor, and then somehow you split. Well, the Y chromosome is changing more slowly, so you'd expect there to be fewer differences in the Y chromosome than the rest of the DNA would have to be changing, and you see the opposite. So that's actually good, gives strong evidence against this idea that apes and humans came from the same creature, or descended from a common ancestor. But then also the idea, you also have one more chromosome pair in chimps than you do in humans. They had to come up with a way, well, how would that happen? So they come up with this idea that maybe there's chromosomes that fuse together. And there's some very convincing videos on the internet from 2005, 2010, but that was before we had the actual science, but saying, oh, here's all this evidence that they fused together, here's proof. Found out in 2018 that didn't happen. So that's, it gets in a lot of detail. Just say they've got a couple copies of the book back there, and I think at least one copy of the DVD that goes through all that. So feel free to borrow it from the congregation, or you can order your own copy if you want. So I think it's getting close to 2 o'clock. Why don't we wrap up here, and I'll just leave this slide up like we had at the start, which again is just Romans 1:16. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jews first and also for the Greek. And then all the examples in the book of Acts of, not all, but a lot of examples in the book of Acts of people basically accepting the free gift of salvation. So especially that last part with the chimps, that was kind of fast. But any questions on anything at all that we talked about this weekend?